We are all limited by the frailties and impermanence of our own bodies. Some people have to struggle more than others. What measures should a society take to ensure that all of its citizens have access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? When it comes to deciding those measures, whose voices are heard? We examine the intersection of disability and public policy today on The Professors.
From across the city and the 7 city colleges of Chicago, broadcasting from 63rd and Halsted at Kennedy King College. Professors take the art of conversation to a higher degree.
I'm Antonio Vasquez from Wilbur Wright College. Joining me today are Sean Dimfel from University of Illinois at Chicago, Joseph Strickland from the Black Male Institute, Levon Stone Sr. from Magic Program, and from the Self-Employment Resources Network, Dave Porter. Sean, would you like to give us just a brief overview of the ADA to introduce the subject to everyone listening today?
Sure. So the ADA was a landmark civil rights legislation passed in 1990 by George Bush I. The importance of this legislation was that it extended civil rights comprehensively to all individuals with disabilities in America. And it basically tries to cover 5 main topics. Title number 1 covers employment, which basically stated that people with disabilities cannot be discriminated against based upon their disability in employment. Secondly was Title 2, which covered public entities and public transportation. Title 3 was for public accommodation. So this is what covers businesses and education and entities of that nature, and it ensures that people with disabilities can enjoy fully the goods and services and facilities that these different entities offer. Fourth was telecommunications, and that all telecommunications had to be accessible to individual disabilities, and that's how we got like the TTY, which is the typewriter telephone. And then Title 5 covered was called just miscellaneous provision, and it covered against coercion for people trying to settle a claim against an employer or a public institution who was not following the ADA, and it protected their rights against that.
I know employment's a big problem among persons with disabilities in terms of just even entering the labor force. And that there's been a significant amount of research that says that while businesses expected that there would be a great outflow of cash for some of the modifications, that 95% of them only require $500 or less in terms of modifying the workspace for persons with disabilities that are in the labor market. And I wonder, Dave, if you could talk about the work in terms of self-employment, because that's an alternative that's outside of the traditional thinking that we picture someone with a disability going out, getting trained, and working for someone else.
Well, I think you can approach it on 3 fronts. First of all, with regards to employment and disabilities, most businesses consider any hiring of an employee to be an investment. And the first thing that has to be approached in terms of trying to figure out how to justify hiring somebody is this person a good investment? Is the person I'm going to bring on board to essentially be the extension of my right arm, is that person going to be someone that I can trust to perform the tasks that I need, to function instinctually in the environment that I'm going to be placing that person in? And thirdly, can I trust that person? Can I depend on that person and not have him or her tap into or deplete other resources that my company might have? The disability, the ADA essentially tells businesses this is what you have to, when you're bringing in a person with disabilities, the accommodations that you would be making to make that person more functional or functional on a job is not an option in terms of something you might consider doing. It's something you have to do. It is basically the law. In terms of employment, though, our employment, the face of employment in this country has changed so much in the 20-some years since the ADA came into play here, that now what we're finding out is that most companies really want to be able to find a way to subcontract the services that they need provided for themselves. For example, I would rather subcontract an accountant than hire one if I can find a way to work that out. As the entire business arena for the country is morphing into this this concept of subcontracting, people with disabilities are finding themselves in a much more viable position in terms of ways that they can participate actively and productively in our economy. So what's happening now is that all businesses are looking to ways to fortify wherever we can the potential that people with disabilities would have in being able to participate productively in the economy by setting up their own businesses and subcontracting their services to companies.
No, I'm just curious, Joe, maybe you could talk a little bit, when you talk about disability, that's one stigma that follows you in the workplace, but I still believe that race has a role in terms of employment in the United States. And so could you talk about the work and research at the Black Male Institute and what you try and do at Magic to help resolve those issues?
Yes, gladly. I'm a researcher at Jane Addams College of Social Work. My research is rooted also in community advocacy. My research is focused on Black males returning to communities after traumatic experiences, being in gangs, having been in prison and jails, and the other is being gunshot victims. So I'm the founder of Magic, which is a community organization that are advocates for the community. One of the things we found is that, as we all know from the news and from our own personal experiences, there's a prevalence of violence in our city and in our state. As a result of this violence, there's been some tragic incidents where people have died, and there's been national and even international outcry about these incidents. However, very little is being done to bring attention to the fact that there are men that are survivors of violence that have spinal cord injuries and are disabled. There's very little being done to ensure that these men making the transition from rehab to home have access to re-enter, or what we call get back in the race, to move towards being in mainstream society. Most of these people were in harm's way because they were undereducated or they were unemployed. So most of them were victims of violence because they were
in their environment.
Yes. So as a result, now they're limited in their ability to get back into the streets. So you have programs and you have great policy to make it accessible for them to get into corporate America, but very little is being done to create that path for them.
And Levon, could you tell us a little bit about your story, if you don't mind sharing?
My personal story was I was 18 years old when I was shot and paralyzed. I was actually intervening with an altercation among two other friends of mine that I was familiar with, I knew from the neighborhood, and one thing led to another. I was shot in the crossfire, basically. I was approximately about 18 and a half years ago, I was shot, paralyzed. My injury is a T6 complete. So since that, I've had this passion to really work with people with disability. It took me a long time to come to this point. But like Joe just said earlier, I was beyond risk at the time. So likely, me with limited education, I went back to the streets, do the things that I was usually doing. So I got caught up in the streets, went to the penitentiary, went to jail, did some time. After coming home, rehabbing, I changed my life. So, in the midst of doing that,
yeah, and that's an important segment of the disability community that hasn't been researched, Sean. I know that you and I had talked a great deal about that.
So approximately 63% of the prison population has one or more disabilities. And this is something that's been essentially completely absent from the literature. No one talks about it. No one even realizes it until I stumbled across it. Because I've been working with Joe and Levon, and some of the problems that we've been having in our program is that these individuals not only, of course, have a disability and they're minorities, but they also have the barriers of having a felony sometimes. And then that is very restrictive in the things that they can do, because you go for a job interview, and what does it say on the job interview application? Have you ever been convicted of a felony? And you have to write that down by law. Mm-hmm. And if you lie, that's grounds for termination. Same thing on an apartment application, and they've had tremendous difficulty in helping their program participants find suitable and accessible housing, because basically they think they're criminals and felons, and no one wants to help them, and it's extremely difficult.
Right, they're not covered under as a protected class
No,
in the
they're
Fair
not.
Housing Act, so they can't be discriminated against because of their disability. But if they were young and they had done something in their past, and I've done stuff in my past that all young kids and young men do when we get a little too much testosterone, and then I've been caught, I'd be sitting in the chair right next to Levon.
So these, what they have in common is they make excellent entrepreneurs, because they're every time a small business person, the most common argument we hear about small business concepts and ideas is that a person isn't going to go into small business because only very few people are successful at that. But the fact is that the less likely your employment in traditional, conventional employment becomes, the more likely you are to have a yen for trying to, first of all, identify, and then hone, and then define, and then take advantage of or exploit whatever your skills happen to be.
Go ahead.
So one of the problems we have in self-employment is, especially with regards to people with disabilities, is convincing people with disabilities, A, that you're already an entrepreneur. You're already reinventing your place in society in terms of the way society works. Instead of following a traditional course, you're, for one reason or another, going to be either moved gently aside in the case of most people, or shoved aside in the case of people like Levon over here, okay, where basically you then become a victim of the system unless somehow systems fall into place that make you feel more like you can be the center of your own universe and create the kind of employment or the kind of lifestyle that you want.
And so that's the whole point of the Disability Studies program at UIC, one of only two that goes in and offers PhD in this, is to go in and make sure that the person with disability is involved. Like Jim Charlton, an author of the book Nothing About Us Without Us, that is, get the people involved in the policy. And that is an imperative because they can see the shortcomings of the policy that the original writers of those laws and legislation never envisioned and didn't understand.
The biggest problem we have in the disability arena is involvement, is direct involvement on the part of the people with disabilities themselves. The biggest problem. Number one, because when this disability subset as a social service model began to develop, a lot of money was poured into upper management, was poured into the top of things.
Go ahead.
Here's a government program. Here's how much we can afford to make it work. Let's find a PhD person somewhere that's had a lot of experience and background, or let's find somebody that's already in government that we can sort of shift and transfer over and give responsibilities to. They created a lot of top-heavy management positions and brought a lot of people who, with all good intent, came over into to these programs. And in fact, Ronald Reagan defined it as the truly needy, where they were going to serve that community. Well, when somebody talks about serving you, there's little room for involvement in that process. So what happens now is we're realizing that serve is still resulting in about 70% unemployment across the board for people with disabilities. We have a lot of overeducated and very underemployed. In fact, we have a lot of people with disabilities whose education far exceeds even what their most remote dream of what they could do is. And then we have a lot of uneducated people with disabilities who are trying to find an identity and who get caught even in the community that they live in. They're stigmatized and they're outcast for that. So we're now having to all go back to the drawing board and say, okay, what happened here? What's going on? Well, the first thing that's going on is that most of these programs were not performance-based. By that I mean, I could put a program together, and as long as it looked good on paper, and as long as I could dot the I's and get the right people to come involved, it would be a good deal. We'd have a lot of ceremonial stuff. But the end result was not quantifiable because, well, after all, the person has a disability. After all, maybe they have multiple disabilities. After all, there's all kinds of reasons why we don't have to really justify what the outcome was. Rule number one seems like it has to be every program has to have a way of justifying its performance based on outcomes. If I set up a program for employment of people with disabilities, I need to show employment. I need to show that people are actually working. Not 90 days, which is the average amount of time that any employer can take somebody on before they terminate them because they're not going to work out. I mean employed. I mean working. The second thing is any program for people with disabilities, as well as any other program, by the way, has to be based on involvement in the process all the time, all along, by the people who are going to benefit from it.